The sound came first. Not a knock. Not a warning. Just the explosive crack of a battering ram splitting wood and metal like it was nothing. 1:17 a.m. The digital clock on the nightstand blinked those numbers in red, and in the half-second between sleep and terror, that's what Simone Blake saw. Red numbers, then chaos. The front door of the two-story home on Maple Ridge Drive didn't just open. It detonated inward, hinges shrieking, the frame splintering into the hallway like shrapnel. Boots hit the floor in a thunder that shook the walls. Voices, sharp and overlapping, barked commands in a language designed to disorient. Police, search warrant.
Get down, hands up.
Don't move. Simone Blake, 34, kindergarten teacher, Sunday school volunteer, woman who baked cookies for the neighborhood kids every other weekend, jerked awake with her heart already in her throat. She didn't scream. She didn't have time. Her body moved on instinct, reaching for the lamp, reaching for her husband, reaching for anything that made sense. But nothing made sense. Not the beams of light slicing through the bedroom doorway. Not the heavy footfalls pounding up the stairs. Not the voices that didn't sound like questions, but orders, cold and militarized. Beside her, Terrence Blake's eyes snapped open. 41 years old. Former Navy SEAL. 12 years of service. 3 deployments. A man trained to assess threats in milliseconds. To control his breathing when chaos erupted. To move with precision when others froze. But this wasn't a desert compound in the middle of the night. This was his home. His bedroom. His wife next to him in a nightgown, confused and terrified. And the sound coming up those stairs wasn't an enemy combatant. It was American law enforcement. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't shout. He put both hands up, slow, visible palms open. Simone, he said, voice low and steady. Hands up. Don't move fast. Do exactly what I say. She looked at him, eyes wide, trembling. She raised her hands. The bedroom door exploded open. 4 officers in tactical gear, faces covered, rifles raised, filled the doorway like a wall of black armor and rage. The lead officer, later identified as Detective Logan Pierce, swept his rifle across the room. Red laser sight cutting through the darkness. Landing first on Terrence, then on Simone. Let me see your hands. Now, both of you. Terrence's voice came out calm, controlled. Our hands are up. We're complying. No one's armed. No sudden movements, but Pierce wasn't listening. He was moving, advancing into the room with 2 other officers flanking him. Behind them, more boots, more voices, the entire house flooding with law enforcement. Get on the ground. Face down, do it now. Terrence moved slowly, deliberately, lowering himself from the bed to the floor. Simone followed, her hands shaking so hard she could barely control them. She knelt first, then flattened herself against the carpet, cheek pressed to the floor, heart hammering so loud she could hear it in her skull. An officer, later identified as Brandon Walsh, moved toward her, rifle still raised, and barked again. Hands behind your back. Don't move. Simone's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She tried to speak, tried to ask what was happening, but the words caught in her throat. Terrence, face down 3 feet away, eyes locked on his wife, kept his voice steady. We're complying. There's no threat here. We're unarmed civilians. That's when it happened. Simone, disoriented, terrified, trying to follow commands, shouted from 3 directions at once, shifted her weight. Maybe she was trying to adjust her arm. Maybe she was trying to breathe. Maybe it was just instinct, the body trying to protect itself from the pressure of cold metal and shouted threats. But Officer Walsh saw movement. In the dark. In the chaos. In the split second where training collides with fear and adrenaline takes over, he fired. The gunshot was deafening in the small bedroom, a single crack that silenced every other sound in the house. Simone's body jerked. Her breath left her in a sharp, broken gasp, and then she went still. Terrence's world stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. He didn't hear the officers shouting anymore. He didn't feel the hands yanking him upright, forcing his arms behind his back, snapping cuffs around his wrists. He saw only her, Simone, on the floor, blood spreading dark and fast beneath her shoulder, pooling on the carpet they'd picked out together 2 years ago. Cream-colored, soft, now soaked red. Simone. His voice cracked, raw, desperate. He tried to move toward her, but hands slammed him back down, knee pressing into his spine, weight crushing the air from his lungs. She's been shot. She needs help. Get a medic! Walsh stood frozen, rifle still raised, eyes wide behind his visor. Pierce moved quickly, shouting into his radio. Shots fired. Officer involved shooting. We need EMS now. Other officers swarmed the room. One kicked Terrence's legs apart, patting him down with rough, hurried hands. Another moved toward Simone, but slowly, hesitantly, like approaching something dangerous instead of a woman bleeding out on her bedroom floor. "Check her for weapons," Pierce ordered. An officer knelt beside Simone, rolled her slightly, hands moving over her nightgown. "No weapon, no phone. Nothing but fabric and blood. She's unarmed," the officer said, voice quieter now. Pierce didn't respond. He was already pulling back, already calculating, already building the narrative that would have to be written in the report. Terrence, hands cuffed behind him, face pressed into the carpet, kept his eyes on his wife. She wasn't moving. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Her eyes were closed. Blood continued to spread beneath her, dark and relentless. "Please," Terrence said, voice breaking. "Please help her." "She didn't do anything. She's a teacher. She's unarmed, please." No one answered him. The bedroom filled with more officers, more voices, more radio static and commands. Someone pulled Terrence to his feet, hands gripping his arms hard enough to bruise. He didn't resist. He didn't fight. He just kept looking back at Simone as they dragged him toward the door. "Don't let her die," he said, voice barely a whisper now. "Please don't let her die." The officers hauled him down the stairs, through the shattered front door, out into the cool night air where red and blue lights painted the street in strobing chaos. Neighbors had emerged from their homes, standing on porches and lawns, hands over mouths, phones raised, recording everything. Nia Patterson, 52, who lived 2 doors down and had known the Blakes since they moved in 4 years ago, stood on her front lawn in her bathrobe, tears streaming down her face. "What did they do?" she shouted toward the officers. "They're good people. What did they do?" No one answered her either. Terrence was shoved into the back of a patrol car, hands still cuffed, head pressed low to fit through the door. The door slammed shut. Through the window, he could see the front of his house, lights blazing from every window, officers moving in and out like ants, and somewhere inside on the floor of the bedroom where he had kissed his wife goodnight just 3 hours ago, Simone lay bleeding. Inside the house, paramedics finally arrived. 2 EMTs rushed up the stairs, medical bags in hand, and found Simone exactly where she'd fallen. They knelt beside her, moving quickly now, cutting away fabric, exposing the wound, pressing gauze, starting an IV. "GSW to the upper left shoulder," one of them called out. "Pulse is weak. Breathing shallow. We need to move her now." They lifted her onto a stretcher, strapping her down, moving fast but careful. Blood soaked through the gauze. Her skin had gone pale, lips losing color. As they carried her down the stairs past the shattered door, past the officers still securing the scene, one of the EMTs looked at Pierce. "Who shot her?" Pierce didn't answer. The ambulance doors closed, sirens wailed, and Simone Blake, who had done nothing but sleep in her own bed, was rushed to County General with a bullet in her body and no idea why. Back in the patrol car, Terrence sat in silence. His hands ached from the cuffs. His chest burned from where the officer's knee had pressed into his spine. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was 3 blocks away. Bleeding, maybe dying, and he couldn't do anything to stop it. He closed his eyes. Not to pray, not to hope. Just to steady himself, because this wasn't over. This was just beginning. At County General, Simone was rushed into emergency surgery. The bullet had entered her shoulder, missed the major artery by inches, but shattered bone and torn through muscle. She would survive. But the damage, physical and otherwise, would last much longer than the surgery. Outside the operating room, a nurse made a call. "Patient is Simone Blake, GSW, officer involved, husband in custody." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Officer involved, as if that explained everything. As if that justified anything. Meanwhile, back on Maple Ridge Drive, the house remained lit up like a stage. Officers moved through every room, opening drawers, checking closets, photographing everything. They were looking for drugs, weapons, evidence of a crime that would explain why they'd been there in the first place. They found nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no gang paraphernalia, no stacks of cash or hidden compartments. Just a normal home, family photos on the walls, a bookshelf filled with novels and military history, a kitchen with meal-prepped containers in the fridge, a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator that said, "Thank you, Mrs. Blake," in crayon. Lieutenant Craig Donovan, the supervising officer, stood in the living room, arms crossed, jaw tight. He looked around at the shattered door, the overturned furniture, the officers still searching, and for the first time that night, doubt crept into his mind. What address did the warrant say? He asked Pierce. Pierce pulled out the folded paper from his vest pocket, scanned it, and read aloud. 4712 Maple Ridge Drive. Donovan looked at the numbers beside the front door. This is 4721. Silence. Pierce's face went pale. Donovan stepped closer, voice dropping low. Tell me you didn't just raid the wrong house. Pierce didn't answer. He just stared at the warrant in his hand, at the address typed clearly at the top, at the number that didn't match. Donovan turned to the other officers. Stop searching. Everyone out now. They froze, confused. Sir, we're not done. I said everyone out. Donovan's voice cracked like a whip. Officers moved quickly, filing out of the house, leaving behind only the wreckage and the realization that everything, from the moment they smashed through that door, had been a mistake. Outside, Nia Patterson was still on her lawn, still recording, still demanding answers. Other neighbors had joined her. Isaiah Monroe, 38, who worked construction and had helped Terrence build a deck last summer, stood with his arms crossed, face hard. That man served this country, he said to anyone listening. And you people just shot his wife in her own home. An officer tried to move him back. Isaiah didn't budge. For what? What did they do? The officer didn't answer. Because there was no answer. Not one that made sense. Not one that would hold up under scrutiny. Not one that would erase the image of Simone Blake, unarmed, compliant, shot in her own bedroom at 1 a.m. At the police station, Terrence sat in an interrogation room, still cuffed, still silent. He hadn't been read his rights. He hadn't been charged. He'd just been placed in a small, windowless room with a metal table and 2 chairs and left there. Hours passed. No one came. No updates. No phone call. Just silence and fluorescent lights and the faint hum of the ventilation system. He didn't sleep. He didn't pace. He just sat, hands folded on the table, eyes fixed on the door, and waited. Because he knew what was coming next. He knew how these situations unfolded. He'd seen it in the military, in the news, in the stories that never quite made sense until you were living them. And now he was. At 4:32 a.m., the door finally opened. Detective Pierce walked in, clipboard in hand, face carefully blank. He sat down across from Terrence, set the clipboard on the table, and folded his hands. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Pierce cleared his throat. Mr. Blake, I need to ask you some questions. Terrence's voice came out flat, emotionless. Where's my wife? Pierce hesitated. She's at County General. She's in surgery. Is she alive? Yes. Terrence exhaled slowly. Then I'm not answering any questions until I see her. Pierce leaned forward. That's not how this works. Terrence met his eyes, steady, unflinching. You broke into my home. You shot my wife. You dragged me out in handcuffs without telling me why. So no, detective, I'm not interested in how you think this works. Pierce's jaw tightened. We had a warrant. For what? Silence. Pierce looked down at the clipboard. We were executing a search warrant for narcotics. Did you find any? More silence. Terrence leaned back in his chair. Let me guess. Wrong address. Pierce didn't confirm it. But he didn't deny it either. And in that silence, Terrence understood everything. This wasn't about evidence. This wasn't about justice. This was about covering up a mistake that had nearly killed his wife. He closed his eyes, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of a truth he'd known his entire life. That no matter how much you served, no matter how much you sacrificed, no matter how clean you lived, one wrong move by someone with a badge could destroy everything, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. The surgery took 4 hours. Dr. Evelyn Harper, chief trauma surgeon at County General, worked with the precision of someone who had spent 2 decades repairing damage caused by bullets, blades, and bad decisions. The bullet had entered Simone Blake's left shoulder at a downward angle, fracturing the clavicle, tearing through the subscapularis muscle, and lodging itself just millimeters from the subclavian artery. 1 inch to the right and Simone would have bled out on her bedroom floor before the ambulance ever arrived. Dr. Harper extracted the bullet, a 9mm hollow point, and placed it in a sterile evidence bag without comment. She repaired the torn muscle tissue, stabilized the fractured bone with a titanium plate and 6 screws, and closed the wound with dissolving sutures beneath the skin and 42 stitches on the surface. When she finally stepped out of the operating room at 6:14 a.m., pulling off her blood-stained gloves, a nurse approached her with a clipboard. "Patient's husband is in police custody. They want updates." Dr. Harper's expression didn't change. He's her next of kin. He gets the update directly, not through a third party. But the police, I don't care what the police want. HIPAA applies to everyone, including officers who shoot unarmed women in their own homes. The nurse hesitated, then nodded. Dr. Harper walked toward the recovery wing, where Simone lay unconscious, breathing through an oxygen mask, first drip feeding antibiotics and pain medication into her bloodstream. Her face was pale, almost gray. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her left shoulder was wrapped in thick bandages, immobilized in a sling. Monitors beeped steadily beside the bed, tracking her heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen levels. Everything stable, everything controlled. Everything except the trauma that would surface once the anesthesia wore off, and she woke to the reality of what had happened. Dr. Harper stood beside the bed for a moment, studying the woman in front of her. Simone Blake, kindergarten teacher, wife. Woman who had been shot by police in her own bedroom for doing absolutely nothing wrong. Dr. Harper had seen a lot of gunshot victims over the years, gang violence, domestic disputes, robberies gone wrong. But this was different. This was the kind of wound that didn't just damage tissue, it shattered trust. It carved out a space inside a person that could never quite be filled again. She turned to the attending nurse. "No police access to this room without a court order. Family only. Understood?" The nurse nodded. Dr. Harper left the room, heading toward the surgical wing's administrative office, where she knew the questions would be waiting. And she was right. Lieutenant Craig Donovan stood in the hallway outside the office, arms crossed, face carefully neutral. When he saw Dr. Harper approaching, he straightened. "Doctor, I need an update on the patient's condition." Dr. Harper stopped in front of him, arms folded. "She's stable. The surgery was successful. She'll recover. Can I see her?" "No." Donovan blinked. "Excuse me? You're not family. You're not her emergency contact. And given that one of your officers shot her, I'm not inclined to grant you any access whatsoever." Donovan's jaw tightened. "This is a police matter." "This is a medical matter," Dr. Harper corrected. "And unless you have a court order, you're not getting anywhere near that woman." Donovan took a step closer, voice dropping. "Doctor, I understand you're protective of your patient, but we need to document her injuries for the investigation. Then submit a formal request through the proper channels. I'll provide the medical records in accordance with the law, but you don't get to waltz into my hospital and interrogate a woman who was shot in her own home 3 hours ago." Donovan's face flushed. "We're trying to figure out what happened." "I know exactly what happened," Dr. Harper said coldly. "Your officers broke into the wrong house, terrified 2 unarmed people, and shot a woman who was complying with every command. That's what happened." Donovan opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. He wasn't used to being challenged. Not by civilians, not by doctors, not by anyone. But Dr. Harper wasn't backing down. She held his gaze unflinching until he finally nodded stiffly. "Fine, I'll submit the request. You do that." She turned and walked into the office, leaving Donovan standing in the hallway alone. Back at the police station, Terrence Blake remained in the interrogation room. The cuffs had been removed at some point, though he couldn't remember when. His wrists were bruised, red marks circling the skin where the metal had dug in. He sat at the table, hands folded, eyes fixed on the door, waiting. He had been waiting for over 5 hours now. No food, no water, no phone call, just silence and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. At 7:03 a.m., the door finally opened again. This time it wasn't Detective Pierce. It was a woman. Mid-40s, dark suit, hair pulled back in a tight bun, eyes sharp and calculating. She carried a leather briefcase in one hand and a tablet in the other. She stepped into the room, closed the door behind her, and sat down across from Terrence without introducing herself. For a long moment, she just looked at him, studying, assessing. Then she set the tablet on the table, opened her briefcase, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Mr. Blake," she said, voice smooth and professional. "My name is Caroline Fletcher. I'm with the district attorney's office." Terrence didn't respond. He just watched her, waiting for the next move. Fletcher slid the paper across the table. I'm here to inform you that you're being released. No charges are being filed at this time. Terrence's eyes flicked down to the paper, then back up to Fletcher. At this time. Fletcher's expression didn't change. The investigation is ongoing. We're still reviewing the circumstances of the incident. The incident, Terrence repeated slowly. Is that what you're calling it? Mr. Blake, you broke into my house in the middle of the night. You shot my wife, and now you're sitting here telling me it's an incident. Fletcher leaned back slightly, folding her hands on the table. I understand you're upset. Upset, Terrence said, voice low and dangerous. My wife is in the hospital with a bullet in her shoulder because your officers raided the wrong house. Upset doesn't begin to cover it. Fletcher's jaw tightened. The officers were executing a lawfully issued warrant for the wrong address. Silence. Fletcher didn't deny it. She couldn't. Terrence leaned forward, eyes locked on hers. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to let me see my wife. You're going to give me every piece of documentation related to that warrant. And you're going to explain to me how a SWAT team ends up at the wrong house at 1 a.m. and shoots an unarmed woman. Fletcher's expression remained carefully neutral. The investigation will determine all of that. The investigation, Terrence said flatly. Right. The same investigation being conducted by the same department that shot my wife. Fletcher stood, picking up her briefcase. You're free to go, Mr. Blake. An officer will escort you out. I'm not leaving until I see my wife. She's at County General. You can see her there. Then take me there. Fletcher paused at the door, glancing back. We don't provide transportation. Then I'll walk. Fletcher hesitated, then nodded. Suit yourself. She left, door closing behind her with a soft click. Terrence sat there for another moment, alone again, processing everything. They weren't charging him. That was good. But they weren't apologizing either. They weren't taking responsibility. They were already building the walls that would protect them from accountability. He'd seen it before. In the military. In the news. In the stories that always ended the same way. Officer-involved shooting. Investigation pending. No wrongdoing found. He stood slowly, joints stiff from sitting too long, and walked to the door. It opened easily, no lock. He'd never been under arrest. He'd just been detained, held, isolated. The hallway outside was empty. He walked toward the front of the station, passing offices with glass windows, officers typing reports, phones ringing, the normal rhythm of a police station at shift change. No one looked at him. No one acknowledged him. He was invisible now, just another black man walking through a building that had decided he didn't matter. At the front desk, a uniformed officer glanced up. Can I help you? I need a ride to County General, Terrence said. The officer's expression didn't change. We don't provide rides. My wife was shot by your officers. She's in surgery. I need to see her. The officer shrugged. Call a cab. Terrence stared at him, disbelief and anger warring in his chest. But he didn't argue. He just turned and walked out the front door into the cool morning air, where the sun was just beginning to rise over the city. The walk to County General took 43 minutes. Terrence moved at a steady pace, hands shoved in his pockets, jaw tight. He didn't have his phone. It was still at the house, probably in an evidence bag somewhere. He didn't have his wallet, same place. He just had himself. And the burning need to see his wife, to know she was alive, to hear her voice, to hold her hand, to tell her he was sorry he couldn't protect her from the people who were supposed to protect both of them. Cars passed him on the street. People walked by on their way to work. The city woke up around him, oblivious to the fact that just hours ago a woman had been shot in her own home by law enforcement. Life went on. It always did. Except for the people caught in the middle of the machinery, the ones chewed up and spit out and left to figure out how to put themselves back together. When Terrence finally reached County General, he walked through the automatic doors into the bright, sterile lobby. A receptionist looked up from behind the desk. Can I help you? Simone Blake, Terrence said, voice rough. She was brought in early this morning. Gunshot wound, surgery. The receptionist typed something into the computer, eyes scanning the screen. Are you family? I'm her husband. ID? Terrence's hands clenched. I don't have it. It's at my house. The police took it. The receptionist hesitated, glancing at her screen again. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't give out patient information without verification." "She's my wife," Terrence said, voice rising. "I need to see her." "Sir, I understand, but she was shot by police in our bedroom 3 hours ago. I've been in custody ever since. I don't have my ID, I don't have my phone. I don't have anything except the need to see my wife and know she's alive. So please just tell me where she is." The receptionist looked at him, really looked at him, and something in his face must have convinced her. She glanced around, then leaned forward slightly. "4th floor. Recovery wing. Room 427. Terrence didn't thank her. He just turned and headed for the elevators, heart pounding, hands shaking. The ride up felt endless. Each floor ding like a countdown. 3rd floor. 4th floor. Doors opened. He stepped out into a quiet hallway, the smell of antiseptic and floor wax heavy in the air. He found room 427 halfway down the corridor. The door was closed. He stood outside for a moment, hand on the handle, bracing himself. Then he pushed it open and stepped inside. Simone lay in the hospital bed, pale and still. Oxygen mask over her face, monitors beeping softly beside her. Her left shoulder was wrapped in thick bandages, arm immobilized in a sling. V-lines ran from her hand to bags of fluid hanging on a metal stand. She looked so small, so fragile. Nothing like the woman who laughed too loud at movies and danced in the kitchen while making breakfast and wore mismatched socks because she said life was too short to care. Terrence crossed the room slowly, each step careful, as if moving too fast might shatter the moment. He reached the bedside, pulled a chair close, and sat down. His hand hovered over hers, afraid to touch, afraid to hurt her. Then gently he wrapped his fingers around hers. Her skin was cool, her hand limp, but she was breathing. She was alive. That was enough. For now, that was enough. He sat there in silence, watching her chest rise and fall, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor, and for the first time since the door exploded inward at 1:17 a.m., he let himself feel it. The fear, the rage, the helplessness, the grief for what had been stolen from them in a single moment of violence and incompetence. He didn't cry. He just held her hand and whispered, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Outside the room in the hallway, Dr. Harper walked past and paused when she saw Terrence through the window. She stood there for a moment, watching the man hold his wife's hand, and something inside her ached. She'd seen a lot of pain in her career, but there was something about this. Something about the way he sat so still, so present, so determined not to let go. She turned and continued down the hallway, leaving them alone. By 10:00 a.m., the story had leaked. Not through official channels. Not through press releases or carefully worded statements from the police department's public information officer. It leaked the way stories like this always do. Through witnesses. Through neighbors with phones and social media accounts. Through people who saw something wrong and refused to stay silent. Nia Patterson, the neighbor who had stood on her lawn at 1 a.m. demanding answers, had posted a video on her community Facebook group at 6:37 a.m. The video was shaky, filmed in the dark with only streetlights and the flashing red and blue of police cruisers for illumination, but the audio was clear. You could hear the shouting, the barked commands, the sound of boots on pavement and radios crackling with static. And you could hear Nia's voice, steady and furious. They just shot someone in that house. An innocent woman. The Blakes. Terrence and Simone. Good people. And the police just shot her. The video had 17 shares within the first hour. By 8 a.m., it had been picked up by a local news blogger. By 9 a.m., it was on the regional news websites. By 10 a.m., it was trending on social media with the hashtag that would define the next several weeks. Hashtag Wrong House, Wrong Life. Vanessa Hayes, a journalist for the Seattle Independent Press, saw the video at 9:12 a.m. while scrolling through her morning feeds with a cup of coffee growing cold on her desk. She watched it 3 times, each viewing sharpening her focus, pulling together the threads of a story she'd covered too many times before. Police raid, wrong address, unarmed victim. The details changed, but the pattern never did. She grabbed her jacket, her recorder, her notebook, and headed out the door. By 9:47 a.m., she was standing on Maple Ridge Drive, looking at the house with the shattered front door. The yellow police tape stretched across the entrance, and the quiet neighborhood that had been turned inside out in the span of a few hours. Neighbors stood in clusters on lawns and driveways, talking in low voices, glancing toward the Blake house like it had become something alien overnight. Vanessa approached Nia Patterson, who was standing on her porch, arms crossed, eyes red from lack of sleep and too many tears. "Ms. Patterson?" Vanessa said gently. "My name is Vanessa Hayes. I'm a journalist with the Independent Press. I saw your video. Can I ask you a few questions?" Nia looked at her for a long moment, weighing whether to trust this stranger with a notebook and a recorder. Then she nodded. "If it helps people understand what happened here, yes." Vanessa pulled out her recorder, set it on the porch railing, and opened her notebook. "Tell me what you saw last night." Nia took a deep breath. "It was after 1 a.m. I heard this loud crash like an explosion. It woke me up. I looked out my window and saw police cars everywhere. Lights flashing. Officers running toward the Blake's house. Then I heard shouting. Commands. It sounded like they were attacking someone, so I came outside." "Did you see them bring anyone out?" Vanessa asked. Nia nodded. "They dragged Terrence out in handcuffs. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't resisting. He just kept asking about his wife. Kept saying, 'Don't let her die.' That's when I knew something terrible had happened." Vanessa wrote quickly, capturing every word. "Do you know the Blakes well?" "Known them for 4 years," Nia said. "Since they moved in. Simone teaches kindergarten. Sweetest woman you'll ever meet. Always helping out, organizing block parties, bringing food when someone's sick. And Terrence is former military. Navy SEAL. Quiet, respectful, always willing to lend a hand. They're good people, the kind of neighbors everyone wants." "Do you know why the police were there?" Vanessa asked carefully. Nia's expression hardened. "That's the thing. There's no reason. No drugs, no crime, no trouble. Just a normal family living their lives. And then the police show up in the middle of the night and shoot Simone in her own bedroom." Vanessa looked up from her notebook. "Do you know if she's okay?" Nia shook her head. "Last I heard, she was in surgery. But I don't know anything beyond that. They won't tell us anything." Vanessa thanked her, took a few photos of the house and the street, and headed toward County General. She had a story to write, but she needed more than just witness accounts. She needed confirmation. She needed hospital records. She needed to talk to someone who could give her the full picture. When she arrived at the hospital, she went straight to the information desk and asked for the public relations office. A receptionist directed her to the 3rd floor, where she found a small office with a nameplate on the door. Maria Santos, Director of Communications. Vanessa knocked. A voice called out, "Come in." Vanessa entered to find Maria Santos, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes, sitting behind a desk covered in folders and coffee cups. "Can I help you?" Maria asked. "Vanessa Hayes, Seattle Independent Press," Vanessa said, pulling out her press credentials. "I'm looking for information on a patient who was brought in early this morning. Simone Blake, gunshot wound, officer-involved shooting." Maria's expression shifted immediately. She set down the pen she'd been holding and leaned back in her chair. "I can't discuss patient information." "I understand HIPAA," Vanessa said, "but this is a matter of public interest. A woman was shot by police in her own home. The community deserves to know what happened." Maria studied her for a moment, then sighed. "All I can confirm is that a patient by that name was admitted early this morning and underwent surgery. She's currently in recovery. Beyond that, you'll need to speak with the Retry H Continue family, or wait for an official statement from the hospital administration." Vanessa nodded, jotting notes. "Can you tell me anything about the nature of her injuries?" "No," Maria said firmly. "But I can tell you that Dr. Evelyn Harper was the attending surgeon. If you want details, you'll need to go through proper channels." Vanessa recognized a brick wall when she hit one. "Thank you for your time." She left the office, rode the elevator down to the main floor, and made her way to the recovery wing. She knew she couldn't just walk into a patient's room, but she could at least try to get a sense of the situation. When she reached the 4th floor, she saw a man sitting outside room 427. Not a doctor, not a nurse. Just a man in rumpled clothes, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. Vanessa approached slowly. "Excuse me, are you Terrence Blake?" The man looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, face drawn with exhaustion and grief. But there was something else there, too. Something harder. Something that hadn't broken yet. "Who's asking?" "Vanessa Hayes. I'm a journalist with the Seattle Independent Press." She held up her hands, showing she wasn't holding a recorder or a camera. "I'm not here to ambush you. I just want to understand what happened." Terrence stared at her for a long moment. You want to understand? You want to write a story? I want to tell the truth, Vanessa said simply. Your neighbors are already talking. The video's already out there. But right now, the only narrative is the one the police department will control. If you want people to know your side, I can help with that. Terrence looked down at his hands. They were still shaking slightly, adrenaline and exhaustion warring in his system. My wife is in that room, he said quietly. She's got a bullet wound in her shoulder because officers broke into our house in the middle of the night and shot her. She didn't have a weapon. She wasn't resisting. She was just lying in bed and they shot her. Vanessa pulled out her notebook slowly, giving him time to object. When he didn't, she began writing. Can you tell me what happened? From the beginning? Terrence took a deep breath, then began. He told her about being woken by the sound of the door exploding inward. About the officers rushing in with rifles and shouted commands. About how he and Simone had complied immediately. Hands up, no sudden movements, doing everything they were supposed to do. About how Simone had been shot anyway. About being dragged out in handcuffs while his wife bled on the floor. About sitting in an interrogation room for hours with no information, no phone call, no rights read. Vanessa wrote it all down, her hand moving quickly across the page. When he finished, she looked up. Did they tell you why they were there? Search warrant for narcotics, Terrence said flatly. They didn't find any. Because there aren't any. We don't use drugs. We don't sell drugs. We're just two people trying to live our lives. Do you know if it was the wrong address? Terrence's jaw tightened. The DA told me the investigation is ongoing, but she didn't deny it when I asked. Vanessa felt the pieces clicking into place. Wrong address. No drugs found. Unarmed victim shot during compliance. This wasn't just a story. This was a pattern, a system failure that kept repeating because no one ever paid the price for it. What do you want people to know? She asked. Terrence looked toward the closed door of room 427. I want them to know that my wife is a kindergarten teacher. She reads to kids. She bakes cookies. She volunteers at church. And she was shot in her own home by people who are supposed to protect us. I want them to know that we did everything right and it didn't matter. Because when you're black in America, doing everything right still isn't enough. Vanessa stopped writing. Not because she didn't want to record his words, but because they needed to sit in the air for a moment. Unfiltered, unedited, true. I'm going to write this story, she said. And I'm going to make sure people see it. Terrence nodded. Just tell the truth. That's all I'm asking. Vanessa left him there, sitting outside his wife's room, and headed back to her office. By noon, she had a draft. By 1 p.m., it was edited. By 2 p.m., it was published online with the headline, Navy SEAL's wife shot in own home during wrong address police raid. The article included witness testimony, details from the scene, and Terrence's account. It included photos of the shattered door, the police tape, the quiet neighborhood turned into a crime scene. And it included the question no one in the police department wanted to answer. How does this keep happening? Within an hour, the story had been shared 2,000 times. Within 2 hours, it was picked up by national news outlets. Within 3 hours, the police department's phones were ringing off the hook with calls from reporters, activists, and citizens demanding answers. Lieutenant Craig Donovan sat in his office, staring at the computer screen showing the article, and realized that the situation he'd hoped to contain had just exploded. At 3:47 p.m., the police department issued a statement. It was brief, carefully worded, and said almost nothing. The Seattle Police Department is aware of the incident that occurred early this morning on Maple Ridge Drive. The matter is under investigation by our Internal Affairs Division. We are committed to transparency and accountability, and we will provide updates as the investigation progresses. Our thoughts are with all those affected. The statement was met with immediate backlash. Social media erupted with comments. Thoughts and prayers aren't enough. Wrong address and they shot someone. How is this not criminal? Defund these incompetent departments before more people die. Vanessa Hayes published a follow-up article 2 hours later, breaking down the police department's statement and pointing out everything it didn't say. It didn't acknowledge the wrong address. It didn't mention Simone Blake by name. It didn't apologize. It didn't take responsibility. It was a masterclass in deflection, and readers saw right through it. By 6 p.m., a protest had formed outside the police headquarters. It started small, just a dozen people with handmade signs. Justice for Simone Blake. Stop raiding wrong houses. Black Lives Matter. But within an hour, the crowd had grown to over 100. By 8 p.m., it was 300. News cameras arrived, capturing footage of the peaceful gathering, the chants, the faces of people who had seen this story play out too many times before, and were done staying silent. Inside the police headquarters, Chief Harold Brennan sat in a conference room with Lieutenant Donovan, Detective Pierce, and the department's legal counsel, Robert Kramer. The mood was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations and defensive posturing. "Walk me through it again," Chief Brennan said, his voice tight. "Every detail." Donovan cleared his throat. The warrant was issued based on intelligence from a confidential informant. The CI claimed there was drug activity at 4712 Maple Ridge Drive. Judge Morrison signed off on the no-knock warrant at 11 p.m. We assembled the tactical team, briefed them on the location, and executed the warrant at 1:17 a.m. And? Brennan pressed. "And we breached the wrong house," Donovan admitted. 4721 instead of 4712. Brennan closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. "How does that happen?" "It was dark," Pierce offered. "The numbers on the houses aren't well lit. You're trained professionals," Brennan snapped. "You don't get to blame poor lighting for raiding the wrong address." Kramer, the legal counsel, leaned forward. "The bigger issue is the shooting." Officer Walsh discharged his weapon. "What was the justification?" Pierce shifted uncomfortably. The subject, Mrs. Blake, moved suddenly. Walsh perceived a threat. Was she armed? No. Did she verbally threaten anyone? No. Did she make any aggressive movements toward the officers? Pierce hesitated. She shifted her position while on the ground. Walsh interpreted it as non-compliance. Kramer let out a long breath. "So an unarmed woman lying face down on her bedroom floor shifted her weight and your officer shot her." "It happened fast," Pierce said defensively. "Split-second decision, high-stress situation. That's not going to fly in court," Kramer said bluntly. "And it's definitely not going to fly in the court of public opinion. This is a nightmare scenario. Wrong address. Unarmed victim. Former military husband. Kindergarten teacher wife. Clean record. And we shot her." Brennan leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "What's the CI's reliability?" Donovan flipped through a file. "He's been used twice before. Both tips led to arrests. And this time? This time he was wrong. Or lying," Kramer added. "Have you verified the CI's information? Checked his background? Made sure he didn't have a grudge against anyone on that street?" Donovan's silence was answer enough. Brennan stood abruptly. "I want a full internal review. Every piece of evidence. Every communication. Every decision point. And I want Officer Walsh placed on administrative leave pending the outcome." Pierce's head snapped up. "Sir, that's going to look like we're throwing him under the bus." "He shot an unarmed woman in her own home," Brennan said coldly. "What exactly do you think it looks like if we don't take action?" The room fell silent. After a moment, Brennan turned to Kramer. "Draft a statement. Acknowledge the wrong address. Express regret for Mrs. Blake's injury. Announce the internal review and Walsh's leave. And make it clear we're cooperating with any external investigations." "That's a lot to admit," Kramer said carefully. "It's the truth," Brennan replied. "And if we don't get ahead of this, it's going to bury us." The meeting ended. Officers filed out, each carrying the weight of a mistake that couldn't be undone. Brennan remained behind, staring at the wall, thinking about the woman in the hospital and the man sitting beside her bed. Thinking about how one bad warrant, one wrong address, one split-second decision had shattered lives and eroded the thin thread of trust between law enforcement and the community they were supposed to serve. At County General, Simone Blake began to wake. The anesthesia was wearing off slowly, dragging her up through layers of fog and confusion. Her eyelids fluttered, her fingers twitched, and then her eyes opened, unfocused at first, blinking against the fluorescent lights overhead. Terrence, still sitting beside her, leaned forward immediately. "Simone, hey, I'm here." Her head turned slightly toward his voice. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then hoarse and weak, "Terrence?" "I'm here," he repeated, squeezing her hand gently. "You're okay? You're in the hospital. You had surgery, but you're going to be okay." Her eyes focused on him slowly, recognition dawning. Then confusion. "What? What happened?" Terrence's throat tightened. How do you tell someone they were shot by police in their own home? How do you explain that the world isn't safe even in bed, even with your hands up, even when you've done nothing wrong? There was a mistake, he said quietly. The police came to our house. There was confusion. You were hurt. But you're safe now. I'm not leaving. Simone's eyes filled with tears. Not from pain, though her shoulder throbbed beneath the bandages, but from the slow, creeping understanding that something fundamental had been broken. They shot me, she whispered. Terrence nodded, his own eyes burning. Yes, why? I don't know, he said honestly, but I'm going to find out. Simone closed her eyes again, exhausted, overwhelmed, unable to process it all. Terrence stayed beside her, holding her hand, and made a silent promise. Someone was going to answer for this. Someone was going to be held accountable, because if they weren't, then nothing mattered. Not the law. Not justice. Not the years he'd spent serving a country that had just proven it didn't value his life or his wife's. Outside the hospital, the protest continued to grow. By midnight, it had swelled to over 500 people. Candles flickered in the darkness. Voices rose in unison. Say her name. Simone Blake! The chant echoed through the streets, carrying on the night air, a reminder that silence was no longer an option. That mistakes had consequences, and that the people were watching. The backlash intensified over the next 48 hours. What started as a local story about a botched police raid exploded into a national conversation about no-knock warrants, police accountability, and the systemic failures that allowed unarmed citizens to be shot in their own homes. Vanessa Hayes' article was cited by major news networks. Cable news panels debated the incident. Civil rights organizations issued statements. And the hashtag WrongHouseWrongLife became a rallying cry for activists across the country. At County General, Simone Blake was moved from the recovery wing to a private room on the 5th floor. The doctors wanted to keep her for observation, monitoring for infection and ensuring her pain was managed. But the physical wounds were only part of the recovery. The psychological trauma ran deeper. Every time a door opened unexpectedly, Simone flinched. Every time she heard footsteps in the hallway, her heart rate spiked. The nurses noticed, Dr. Harper noticed, and Terrence, who barely left her side, noticed most of all. She needs more than pain medication, Dr. Harper told him on the 2nd day. She needs trauma counseling. What happened to her isn't something you just recover from with physical therapy. Terrence nodded. Can you recommend someone? Dr. Harper handed him a card. Dr. Monica Reeves. She specializes in PTSD and trauma recovery. I've already reached out to her. She's willing to meet with Simone as soon as she's ready. Thank you, Terrence said quietly. Dr. Harper studied him for a moment. What about you? What about me? You were there too. You watched your wife get shot. You were dragged out of your home in handcuffs. You sat in a police station for hours not knowing if she was alive. That's trauma too. Terrence looked away. I'm fine. No, you're not, Dr. Harper said gently. And pretending you are won't help either of you. Terrence didn't argue. He just took the card and tucked it into his pocket. There would be time for that later. Right now, his focus was Simone. Making sure she was safe. Making sure she had everything she needed. Making sure the people responsible for what happened didn't get away with it. On the 3rd day, Simone was finally strong enough to talk about it. Not for long, not in detail, but enough to start processing. Terrence sat beside her bed, holding her hand as she spoke in a quiet, halting voice. I keep seeing them, she said. The officers. The guns, the lights. I close my eyes and it's all I see. I know, Terrence said. I was so scared, Simone continued. I didn't know what was happening. I thought maybe it was a home invasion. Or a mistake. I kept thinking if I just did what they said it would be okay. But it wasn't okay. No, Terrence agreed. It wasn't. Why did they shoot me? Simone asked, her voice breaking. I didn't do anything. I had my hands up. I was on the ground. Why did they shoot me? Terrence didn't have an answer. Not one that made sense. Not one that would ease the pain or confusion. I don't know, he said. But I'm going to make sure we get answers. Simone looked at him, eyes red from crying. I don't feel safe anymore. Even here, even with you, I don't feel safe. Those words hit Terrence harder than anything else, because he understood. He'd spent 12 years in the military learning how to assess threats, neutralize danger, protect his team. But he couldn't protect her from this. He couldn't neutralize the fear that had taken root inside her, and he couldn't guarantee that the system designed to serve and protect wouldn't fail them again. I'm going to do everything I can, he said quietly. I promise you that. Simone closed her eyes, exhausted. I just want to go home. Soon, Terrence said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. Their home had been torn apart. The front door was still shattered. The bedroom floor still stained with blood. Even if they could physically return, would it ever feel like home again? Later that afternoon, Terrence received a call from an unknown number. He stepped into the hallway to answer. Hello? Mr. Blake? This is Jonathan Reed. I'm an attorney with the Coalition for Civil Justice. I've been following your case and I'd like to offer my services. Terrence's first instinct was suspicion. Lawyers didn't just call out of the goodness of their hearts. Why? Because what happened to you and your wife is exactly the kind of case we take on, Reed said. Police misconduct, excessive force, violation of civil rights. We've successfully litigated dozens of similar cases, and we believe you have strong grounds for a lawsuit. I haven't even thought about a lawsuit, Terrence said honestly. I understand, Reed replied. Right now your focus is on your wife's recovery. But at some point you're going to want accountability, not just an internal investigation that goes nowhere. Real accountability. And that comes through the courts. Terrence leaned against the wall, processing. What would a lawsuit accomplish? Several things, Reed said. First, it would force the police department to disclose all evidence related to the raid. The warrant. The intelligence. The decision-making process. Everything. Second, it would provide financial compensation for your wife's medical expenses, pain and suffering, and lost wages. Third, and most importantly, it would create a public record that can be used to push for policy changes. No-knock warrants, officer training, accountability measures. Change doesn't happen without pressure. Terrence was silent for a long moment. I need to talk to my wife. Of course, Reed said. Take all the time you need. But if you're interested, I'd like to meet with you both. No obligation. Just a conversation about your options. I'll call you back, Terrence said. He hung up and stood in the hallway, staring at the phone in his hand. A lawsuit meant dragging everything into the open. It meant reliving the trauma. It meant facing the officers who had destroyed their sense of safety. But it also meant forcing the system to answer for what it had done. And maybe, just maybe, preventing it from happening to someone else. When he returned to Simone's room, she was awake, staring at the ceiling. Who was that? She asked. A lawyer, Terrence said. He wants to represent us in a lawsuit against the police department. Simone turned her head to look at him. Do you think we should? I don't know, Terrence admitted. But I think we should at least hear what he has to say. Simone was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. Okay, set up a meeting. That evening, Vanessa Hayes published another article. This one focused on the confidential informant whose tip had led to the raid. Through public records requests and interviews with sources inside the police department, she had uncovered troubling details. The informant, whose identity was protected, had provided information that led to 2 previous arrests. But he also had a criminal record. Drug possession, fraud, and most damning, a history of providing false information to settle personal scores. The article raised questions the police department couldn't ignore. Had the informant been properly vetted? Had his information been corroborated? Had anyone bothered to verify the address before assembling a tactical team and smashing through a door in the middle of the night? The answers, based on Vanessa's reporting, appeared to be no. Public outrage intensified. The protests outside police headquarters grew larger and more organized. Community leaders called for the police chief's resignation. Civil rights organizations demanded federal oversight, and the Blake family, still recovering in a hospital room, became the face of a movement demanding change. On the 4th day, Officer Brandon Walsh, the officer who had shot Simone, was placed on paid administrative leave. The announcement was made through a terse press release that acknowledged the ongoing investigation, but provided no details about Walsh's status or the department's findings. Activists pointed out that paid leave wasn't accountability. It was a vacation. Walsh was at home collecting a paycheck, while Simone Blake was in a hospital bed with a bullet wound. The police union immediately issued a statement defending Walsh. Officer Walsh acted in accordance with his training in a high-stress, rapidly evolving situation, armchair quarterbacking by individuals who have never faced the split-second decisions required of law enforcement does a disservice to all officers who put their lives on the line every day. The statement was tone-deaf and inflammatory. Social media erupted. She was unarmed and on the ground. High-stress situation you created by raiding the wrong house. If that's what training produces, the training is the problem. The backlash was swift and severe. Within hours, the union deleted the statement. But the damage was done. Screenshots had been taken. Articles had been written. And the narrative that the police department was more interested in protecting its officers than holding them accountable was solidified. On the 5th day, Simone was discharged from the hospital. Dr. Harper cleared her for home recovery with strict instructions. Physical therapy for the shoulder. Pain medication is needed. Follow-up appointments every week. And counseling. Mandatory counseling. Simone agreed to all of it, though the thought of returning home filled her with dread. Terrence had spent the previous day at the house, working with a contractor to repair the front door and clean the bedroom. The blood-stained carpet had been ripped out and replaced. The shattered door frame had been rebuilt. The walls had been repainted. He'd done everything he could to erase the physical evidence of what had happened, but he knew it wasn't enough. The scars ran deeper than walls and floors. When they pulled into the driveway, Simone stared at the house through the car window, her hands trembling. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "We don't have to," Terrence said. "We can stay somewhere else, a hotel." Nia offered her guest room. "We have options." Simone shook her head. "No, this is our home. I'm not letting them take that from me, too." She opened the car door and stepped out slowly, her left arm still in a sling, her movements careful and deliberate. Terrence walked beside her, close enough to catch her if she stumbled, far enough to let her move on her own. They reached the front door. The new door. Solid wood. Strong lock. No signs of violence. But Simone hesitated, hand hovering over the handle. "It's okay," Terrence said softly. "I'm right here." Simone took a deep breath, turned the handle, and stepped inside. The house was quiet, clean, almost normal. But it didn't feel normal. It felt like a stage set. Like someone had recreated their home but forgotten to add the warmth, the comfort, the sense of safety that made it theirs. She walked slowly through the living room, the kitchen, the hallway. Everything was in its place. Photos on the walls, books on the shelves, the couch where they watched movies, the table where they ate dinner. But it all felt distant now, like looking at someone else's life through a window. When she reached the bedroom, she stopped. Terrence had done his best. New carpet, fresh paint, clean linens on the bed, but she could still see it. The officers, the guns, the moment she'd been shot. It was written into the space like invisible ink, visible only to her. "I can't sleep in here," she said quietly. "Then we won't," Terrence replied. "We'll sleep in the guest room. Or on the couch. Wherever you feel safe." Simone turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "What if I never feel safe again?" Terrence pulled her into a gentle embrace, careful of her injured shoulder. "Then we'll figure it out together, one day at a time." They stood there in the hallway holding each other, two people trying to rebuild a life that had been shattered in 9 minutes. And outside, beyond the repaired door in the quiet street, the fight for accountability was just beginning. Jonathan Reed arrived at the Blake residence exactly on time. 6 feet tall, early 40s, wearing a dark suit that managed to look both professional and approachable. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and extended the other for a handshake when Terrence opened the door. "Mr. Blake, thank you for agreeing to meet." "Come in," Terrence said, stepping aside. Reed entered, taking in the modest but well-maintained home with a quick, assessing glance. Simone sat on the couch in the living room, her left arm still in a sling, her posture careful and guarded. Reed approached slowly, respectfully. "Mrs. Blake, I'm Jonathan Reed. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me." "I know this is difficult," Simone nodded but didn't speak. Reed sat in the chair across from them, set his briefcase on the coffee table, and pulled out a yellow legal pad and pen. "Before we begin, I want to be clear about a few things. First, this conversation is confidential. Nothing you tell me leaves this room unless you decide to move forward with legal action. Second, you're under no obligation to hire me or pursue a lawsuit. This is just an exploratory conversation. And third, my firm works on contingency. That means you don't pay unless we win. Our fee comes from the settlement or judgment." "What kind of fee?" Terrence asked. "Standard is 33%, Reed said. If the case goes to trial, it's 40%. but we cover all costs up front. Expert witnesses, court fees, investigations. You don't pay a dime out of pocket. Terrence and Simone exchanged a glance. Okay, Terrence said. What do you need to know? Reed clicked his pen. Everything. Start from the beginning. What happened the night of the raid? For the next hour, Terrence and Simone recounted the events. Terrence did most of the talking, his voice steady and factual, detailing the sound of the door being breached, the officers storming in, the commands, the moment Simone was shot. Simone added details when she could, though her voice was quieter, more hesitant. She described the confusion, the terror, the sensation of being shot, and the aftermath in the hospital. Reed took notes the entire time, occasionally pausing to ask clarifying questions. Did any officer identify themselves before breaching the door? Were you given time to respond before they entered? Did anyone provide medical aid immediately after the shooting? The answers painted a damning picture. No identification, no warning, no immediate aid. When they finished, Reed set down his pen and leaned back. Based on what you've told me, I believe you have a very strong case. Multiple constitutional violations. Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure. 14th Amendment, violation of due process. Excessive force, negligence, the list goes on. What about the officer who shot me? Simone asked. Does he face charges? Reed's expression grew somber. That's a separate matter. Criminal charges would be filed by the district attorney's office, not through a civil lawsuit. And historically, officers are rarely charged in these situations, even when the evidence is clear. So he gets away with it, Simone said bitterly. Not necessarily, Reed replied. A civil lawsuit can still hold him accountable. We can name him personally as a defendant, along with the police department and the city. If we win, he could face financial liability. It's not criminal charges, but it's something. What are the chances we win? Terrence asked. Reed considered the question carefully. In a civil rights case like this, the burden of proof is lower than in criminal court. We don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. We just have to show that more likely than not your rights were violated and you suffered damages as a result. Given the facts: wrong address, unarmed victim, clear evidence of injury, I'd say our chances are very good. The real question is how much we can win. How much are we talking about? Terrence asked. That depends on several factors, Reed said. Medical expenses, both past and future. Lost wages. Pain and suffering. Emotional distress. Punitive damages. In cases like this, settlements or judgments can range from hundreds of thousands to several $1 million. Simone looked at Terrence. I don't care about the money. I just want them to admit they were wrong. Reed nodded. I understand. But the reality is, money is the only language the system speaks. A large settlement or judgment gets attention. It forces policy changes. It makes other departments think twice before conducting no-knock raids. It's not just about compensation. It's about creating consequences. Terrence leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What happens if we move forward? What's the process? First, we file a complaint in federal court, Reed explained. That document outlines the facts of the case and the legal claims. Once filed, the defendants, the police department, the city, Officer Walsh have to respond. Then we enter the discovery phase. That's where we gather evidence. Depositions, document requests, expert reports. The defendants will fight us every step of the way. They'll try to get the case dismissed. They'll argue qualified immunity for the officers. They'll drag it out as long as possible. How long does it take? Simone asked. On average, 2 to 3 years, Reed said. Sometimes longer. It's not a quick process. But during that time, we'll also be negotiating. Most cases settle before trial. The city doesn't want the bad publicity of a trial, and we don't want the uncertainty of a jury verdict. So we push for a settlement that includes both financial compensation and policy changes. What kind of policy changes? Terrence asked. Ban on no-knock warrants, mandatory body cameras for all tactical operations, independent oversight of police raids, officer training reforms, whatever we can negotiate. The goal is to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. Simone looked at Terrence again, searching his face. What do you think? Terrence was quiet for a moment. I think we don't have a choice. If we don't do this, they'll sweep it under the rug. They'll call it an unfortunate incident and move on. And the next family won't be as lucky as we were. Lucky, Simone repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. You're alive, Terrence said gently. That's more than some people get in situations like this. Simone closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. Okay, let's do it. Reed nodded, his expression serious. I'll start drafting the complaint immediately. I'll need you to sign some documents authorizing me to represent you, and giving me access to medical records, police reports, anything related to the case. I'll also need you to come to my office for a formal interview. We'll go through everything again in more detail, and I'll have my investigators start gathering evidence. What about the media? Terrence asked. They've been calling non-stop. Don't talk to them, Reed said firmly. Not yet. Once we file the lawsuit, we can coordinate media interviews. But until then, anything you say can be used against you. The department's lawyers will twist your words, claim you're exaggerating or lying. It's better to stay silent and let the legal process speak for itself. The journalist who's been covering the story, Vanessa Hayes, she's been fair, Terrence said. Should we talk to her? Reed considered. Hayes has done good work. If you want to make a statement through her, we can coordinate that. But it needs to be carefully worded, nothing that could jeopardize the case. Understood, Terrence said. Reed packed up his briefcase and stood. I know this is overwhelming, but you're doing the right thing, not just for yourselves, but for everyone who's been failed by the system. After Reed left, Terrence and Simone sat in silence. The weight of the decision settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were about to go to war with the police department, the city, and every institution designed to protect law enforcement from accountability. It was going to be long, painful, and exhausting, but it was also necessary. Are you sure about this? Simone asked quietly. Terrence took her hand. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The next morning, Jonathan Reed filed a federal civil rights lawsuit on behalf of Terrence and Simone Blake against the city of Seattle, the Seattle Police Department, Officer Brandon Walsh, Detective Logan Pierce, and Lieutenant Craig Donovan. The complaint was 63 pages long, meticulously detailed and devastating in its accusations. It outlined the facts of the raid: the wrong address, the lack of verification, the decision to use a no-knock warrant based on uncorroborated information from an unreliable informant, the excessive force, the shooting of an unarmed compliant woman, the failure to provide immediate medical aid, the detention of Terrence without cause, the pattern of misconduct that had been allowed to persist without accountability. The complaint demanded compensatory damages for medical expenses, lost wages, pain and suffering, and emotional distress. It demanded punitive damages to punish the defendants for their reckless conduct, and it demanded injunctive relief court-ordered policy changes to prevent future violations. News of the lawsuit broke within hours. Vanessa Hayes published an article with the headline, Blake Family Files Federal Lawsuit Over Wrong Address Raid and Shooting. The article included excerpts from the complaint, quotes from Reed, and reactions from community leaders and activists. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Supporters flooded social media with messages of solidarity, justice for the Blakes, hold them accountable. This is how Change Retry H Continue happens. Donations poured into a legal defense fund Reed's firm had set up, even though the Blakes weren't paying out of pocket. People wanted to contribute. They wanted to be part of the fight, but the backlash was equally fierce. The police union issued another statement, this time more measured but no less defensive. We stand by our officers who acted in good faith, based on the information available to them. This lawsuit is a transparent attempt to undermine law enforcement and capitalize on an unfortunate incident. We will vigorously defend against these baseless allegations. The word baseless triggered another wave of outrage. Isaiah Monroe, the neighbor who had helped Terrence build his deck, organized a community meeting at the local church. Over 200 people showed up. The small sanctuary was packed, standing room only, with overflow spilling into the fellowship hall. Isaiah stood at the podium, his voice carrying over the crowd. We're here tonight because what happened to Terrence and Simone Blake could have happened to any of us. They did everything right. They were in their own home, sleeping in their own bed, and they were terrorized by the people who are supposed to protect us. This isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern, and it stops when we say it stops. The crowd erupted in applause. Speaker after speaker took the podium. A grandmother who had watched police rough up her grandson during a traffic stop. A teacher who had seen students profiled and harassed. A veteran who talked about serving his country only to be treated like a threat when he came home. Each story added to the mounting evidence that the problem wasn't just one bad raid. It was systemic. Nia Patterson spoke last. She stood at the podium, hands gripping the edges, and looked out over the crowd. I've known Simone and Terrence for 4 years. They're good neighbors. Good people. And on that night I watched the police drag Terrence out in handcuffs while his wife was inside bleeding. I watched them treat him like a criminal when he was the victim. And I stood on my lawn and I asked, what did they do? Nobody answered me that night. But I'm asking again now, and I'm not stopping until I get an answer. The crowd rose to its feet, applause thundering through the church. The meeting ended with a plan. Organize regular protests, attend city council meetings, demand accountability from elected officials, apply pressure at every level until change happened. At the Blake residence, Terrence and Simone watched news coverage of the community meeting on their laptop. Simone's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of gratitude. I didn't know so many people cared, she whispered. They care, Terrence said, because they know it could have been them. 3 days after the lawsuit was filed, the city's legal team filed a motion to dismiss. The argument was predictable: qualified immunity. The officers, they claimed, had acted in good faith based on the information available to them. They couldn't have known the address was wrong. They couldn't have known Simone would move suddenly. They were protected from liability because a reasonable officer in the same situation would have acted the same way. Reed had expected this. Qualified immunity was the shield law enforcement used to avoid accountability in nearly every civil rights case. It was a legal doctrine created by the courts, not by legislation, and it had been expanded over the years to the point where it was almost impossible to hold officers liable for misconduct. But Reed wasn't backing down. He filed a response brief arguing that qualified immunity didn't apply when officers violated clearly established constitutional rights. The right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures was clearly established. The right not to be shot when unarmed and compliant was clearly established. The officer's conduct was so egregious that no reasonable officer could have believed it was lawful. The legal battle was joined. Motions and countermotions, briefs and responses. The case moved slowly through the federal court system, each procedural step taking weeks or months. But outside the courtroom, the pressure continued to build. Vanessa Hayes kept publishing. She obtained the police department's internal incident reports through a public records request. The reports were heavily redacted, but what remained was damning enough. They confirmed the wrong address. They confirmed that no drugs were found. They confirmed that Simone was unarmed. And they revealed something new. Officer Walsh had been involved in 2 other questionable shootings in the past 5 years. Both times he'd been cleared by internal investigations. The article documenting Walsh's history went viral. Officer who shot Simone Blake has history of questionable force, the headline read. Activists pointed to it as proof that the problem wasn't one bad decision. It was a pattern of behavior that had been excused and enabled by a department more interested in protecting its own than serving the community. The police chief, Harold Brennan, who had initially tried to manage the crisis quietly, found himself under siege. City council members demanded answers. The mayor, facing re-election, distanced himself from the department. Community groups called for Brennan's resignation. The pressure became unbearable. 6 weeks after the raid, Chief Brennan announced his retirement. The official statement cited personal reasons and a desire to spend more time with family. But everyone knew the truth. He was being forced out. The city needed a scapegoat, and Brennan was it. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as accountability. Others saw it as a distraction. The chief retiring doesn't change the fact that Simone Blake was shot in her own home, Isaiah Monroe told reporters. We need systemic change, not just personnel changes. The city appointed an interim chief, a woman named Rebecca Hart, who had a reputation as a reformer. Her first act was to announce a comprehensive review of the department's use of no-knock warrants. Her second was to meet with community leaders, including representatives from the coalition that had formed around the Blake case. The meeting was tense. Community members didn't trust Hart, even if she had a good reputation. They'd heard promises before. They'd seen review committees and task forces that produced reports full of recommendations that were never implemented. They wanted action, not words. Hart, to her credit, seemed to understand. I can't change what happened to the Blakes, she said. but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. I'm implementing an immediate moratorium on no-knock warrants pending the completion of the review. Any future use will require approval from my office and corroboration of intelligence from at least 2 independent sources. We're also mandating body cameras for all tactical operations, with footage to be preserved and made available in accordance with public records laws. It was a start. Not enough, but a start. The community representatives made that clear. We'll be watching, one of them said. And if these changes don't stick, we'll be back. Meanwhile, the lawsuit ground forward. Discovery began. Reed's team issued subpoenas for police department records, including the warrant application, internal communications, and Officer Walsh's personnel file. The city fought every request, claiming privilege, confidentiality, and relevance objections. Each fight required a motion to the judge, followed by briefing, followed by a hearing. It was exhausting and expensive, but Reed's firm absorbed the costs as promised. Depositions were scheduled. Terrence would be deposed. Simone would be deposed. Officer Walsh, Detective Pierce, and Lieutenant Donovan would all be deposed. The process was designed to gather testimony under oath, to lock people into their stories before trial. It was also designed to be intimidating, especially for plaintiffs who had never been through the legal system before. Reed spent hours preparing Terrence and Simone. They're going to try to rattle you, he warned. They'll ask the same question 15 different ways, hoping you'll contradict yourself. They'll bring up irrelevant details to make you look bad. They'll try to portray you as opportunists looking for a payday. Don't take the bait. Answer the question asked, nothing more. If you don't know, say you don't know. If you don't remember, say you don't remember. And if I object, stop talking. Terrence's deposition was first. It took place in a conference room at the city attorney's office. Terrence sat on one side of a long table, Reed beside him. Across from them sat 3 lawyers representing the city and the officers, along with a court reporter recording every word. The lead defense attorney, a man named Philip Hargrove, was in his 50s with silver hair and a courtroom demeanor that radiated confidence and condescension. He began with basic background questions: Terrence's age, occupation, military service. Then he moved to the night of the raid. Mr. Blake, when the officers entered your home, did you comply with their commands? Yes. Did you resist in any way? No. Did your wife resist? No. Did either of you make any threatening movements? No, we had our hands up. We got on the ground. We did exactly what they told us to do. Hargrove leaned back, studying Terrence. You're a former Navy SEAL, correct? Yes. So you're trained in combat, weapons, tactical operations, Reed interjected. Objection, relevance, Hargrove smiled slightly. I'm establishing Mr. Blake's background and capabilities. My client's military service has nothing to do with whether he was wrongfully shot in his own home, Reed said. It goes to the officer's perception of threat. Hargrove countered. The back and forth continued, each side staking out positions. Terrence remained calm, answering questions without elaborating, following Reed's instructions. But inside he was seething. They were trying to make his service, his training, his identity, into a justification for what had happened, as if being a veteran made him more dangerous, as if his wife deserved to be shot because he knew how to handle a weapon. The deposition lasted 6 hours. When it finally ended, Terrence was exhausted. Reed walked him out to the parking garage. You did great, Reed said. They didn't get anything they can use against us. They tried, Terrence said bitterly. Of course they did. That's their job. But you didn't give them anything. Simone's deposition was scheduled for the following week. Terrence wanted to be there, but Reed advised against it. They'll use your presence to suggest you're coaching her. It's better if she goes in alone. I'll be with her. Simone was terrified. The thought of sitting across from lawyers representing the people who had shot her, answering questions about the worst night of her life, was almost unbearable. But she agreed, because backing down meant letting them win, and she wasn't ready to do that. The day of her deposition, Terrence drove her to the city attorney's office and waited in the lobby. Simone walked into the conference room with Reed, her left arm still in a sling, her movements still careful. The defense attorneys rose when she entered, a show of courtesy that felt hollow. Hargrove began with the same background questions. Then he moved to the shooting. Mrs. Blake, when Officer Walsh discharged his weapon, where were you? On the floor, face down. Were your hands visible? Yes, they were behind my back. Did you make any sudden movements? Simone hesitated. This was the question she'd been dreading, because the answer was complicated. She had moved. She'd shifted her weight because the pressure on her chest was making it hard to breathe, but in that split second, that tiny adjustment, Officer Walsh had seen a threat. "I may have adjusted my position slightly," she said carefully. "It was hard to breathe with my chest pressed against the floor." Hargrove pounced. "So you did move," Reed interjected immediately. "Objection. Mischaracterizes the testimony." "She just said she moved," Hargrove insisted. "She said she adjusted her position to breathe," Reed corrected. "That's not the same as making a threatening movement." The exchange continued, each side fighting over every word. Simone sat in the middle, feeling like she was on trial for being shot. By the time the deposition ended 4 hours later, she was shaking, tears streaming down her face. Reed escorted her out quickly, guiding her to a private room where Terrence was waiting. Terrence pulled her into his arms, careful of her shoulder. "It's over," he whispered. "You did it." "They made it sound like it was my fault," Simone sobbed. "Like I deserved it." "No," Terrence said firmly. "They're trying to create doubt. But the facts are on our side. You were unarmed. You were compliant. They shot you. Nothing they say changes that." Reed stood in the doorway, giving them space. He'd seen this before. Depositions were traumatic for victims, especially in cases involving police violence. The defense attorneys didn't care about the emotional toll. They cared about winning. And if breaking a witness down helped them win, they'd do it without hesitation. But Reed also knew that depositions cut both ways. In 2 weeks, he'd be deposing Officer Walsh, and he was going to make sure Walsh faced the same scrutiny, the same pressure, the same accountability that the Blakes had endured. Officer Brandon Walsh's deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. Reed arrived early, setting up his materials in the conference room his firm had reserved for the occasion. He arranged his notes, checked his recorder, and reviewed the key points he intended to cover. Across the table would sit Walsh and his attorneys, representatives from the police union and the city's legal team. It would be hostile. But Reed had been doing this long enough to know how to handle hostile. Walsh arrived 10 minutes late, flanked by 2 attorneys. He was younger than Reed expected, maybe 32, with close-cropped hair and a clean-shaven face that made him look even younger. He wore a suit instead of his uniform, a strategic choice to make him look less like a cop and more like a regular person. But the effect was undermined by his posture, rigid and defensive, shoulders squared like he was preparing for combat. Reed stood and extended his hand. "Officer Walsh, Jonathan Reed." Walsh shook his hand briefly, his grip tight, his expression neutral. They sat, the court reporter positioned at the end of the table, ready to record every word. Reed began with the standard preliminaries, swearing Walsh in, establishing his background and employment history. Walsh answered in clipped, precise sentences, offering nothing beyond what was asked. Then Reed moved to the night of the raid. "Officer Walsh, can you describe your role in the operation on the morning of the incident?" "I was part of the tactical entry team," Walsh said. "My assignment was to secure the second floor of the residence." "And when you entered the bedroom where Mr. and Mrs. Blake were sleeping, what did you observe?" "2 subjects on the bed. I ordered them to show their hands and get on the ground. Did they comply?" "Yes. Were they armed?" Walsh hesitated just for a fraction of a second. "Not that I could see at the time." Reed made a note. "At the time? So you weren't certain?" "In a tactical situation, you can't always be certain," Walsh said. "You have to assess threats based on behavior and positioning. And what behavior did Mrs. Blake exhibit that you assessed as a threat?" "She moved suddenly while on the ground." "Moved how?" "Shifted her position. It could have been reaching for a weapon." Reed leaned forward slightly. "Could have been. But you didn't see a weapon, did you?" "No." "And after you shot her, did you find a weapon?" "No." "Was Mrs. Blake wearing clothing that could have concealed a weapon?" Walsh's jaw tightened. "She was wearing a nightgown." "A nightgown," Reed repeated. "So thin fabric, minimal coverage. Not exactly tactical gear." One of Walsh's attorneys interjected. "Objection, argumentative." Reed didn't back down. "Officer Walsh, in your training, were you taught to assess the totality of circumstances before using deadly force?" "Yes." "And the totality of circumstances here included a woman in a nightgown, lying face down on the floor with her hands visible behind her back, correct?" "Yes." "No weapon visible." Correct. No verbal threats. Correct. No aggressive movements toward you or any other officer. Walsh's voice grew harder. She moved unexpectedly in a high-stress situation. High-stress situation that you created by breaking into the wrong house in the middle of the night, Reed said, his tone sharp now. Walsh's attorney jumped in. Objection. The officer didn't determine the address. But he participated in the raid, Reed countered, and he pulled the trigger. So let's talk about that decision. Officer Walsh, how much time elapsed between when you perceived Mrs. Blake's movement and when you fired your weapon? Walsh hesitated. I don't know exactly, seconds. Less than 1 second. Possibly. So you saw a woman in a nightgown shift her weight on the floor, and within less than 1 second, you decided to shoot her. I perceived a threat and responded according to my training. Your training tells you to shoot unarmed women in nightgowns. Objection. Walsh's attorney was on his feet now. This is badgering. Reed sat back, letting the tension settle. I'll rephrase. Officer Walsh, in your career, how many times have you discharged your weapon in the line of duty? Walsh's expression flickered. 3 times, including this incident? Yes. And the other 2 times, what were the circumstances? Walsh's attorney leaned forward. That's not relevant to this case. It's absolutely relevant, Reed said. It goes to Officer Walsh's pattern of behavior and decision-making. The attorney looked like he wanted to argue further, but Walsh spoke first. One was a suspect fleeing a robbery who turned toward me with what appeared to be a weapon. The other was a domestic violence situation where the suspect advanced on me with a knife. And in both cases, were you cleared of wrongdoing? Yes. By internal investigations conducted by your own department? Yes. Reed made another note. Officer Walsh, have you ever received training on implicit bias? Yes. And what did that training teach you? Walsh shifted in his seat. That officers need to be aware of unconscious biases that might affect their decision-making. Did you consider the possibility that implicit bias played a role in your decision to shoot Mrs. Blake? No. Why not? Because my decision was based on the immediate threat assessment, not on any bias. Reed leaned back, studying Walsh. The officer was good at staying on script, repeating the language he'd been coached to use. But there were cracks, the hesitations, the defensive body language, the slight edge in his voice when challenged. Officer Walsh, do you regret shooting Mrs. Blake? The question hung in the air. Walsh's attorneys tensed, probably ready to object, but Walsh answered before they could. I regret that she was injured. But I stand by my decision in the moment. You stand by shooting an unarmed woman. I stand by my assessment of the threat based on the information I had at the time. Reed closed his notebook. No further questions. The deposition ended and Walsh left quickly, his attorneys flanking him like bodyguards. Reed sat alone in the conference room for a moment, reviewing his notes. Walsh had given him everything he needed. The admission that Simone was unarmed. The admission that the movement was minimal. The admission that the decision was made in less than a second. And most damning, the pattern of shootings that had been excused by internal investigations. Reed called Terrence that afternoon. Walsh's deposition went well. He's locked into his story now, and it's not a good story. What happens next? Terrence asked. Next, we depose Pierce and Donovan. Then we start bringing in expert witnesses. Use of force experts who can testify that Walsh's actions were unreasonable. Medical experts who can testify about Simone's injuries and long-term prognosis, and we'll depose the confidential informant if we can identify him. Can you do that? Terrence asked. I thought CIs were protected. They are, but not absolutely, Reed said. If the CI's information is central to the case, we can argue that the defendant's right to a fair trial outweighs the need for confidentiality. It's an uphill battle, but I've won it before. The depositions of Detective Pierce and Lieutenant Donovan followed over the next 3 weeks. Pierce was defensive, insisting that he had followed protocol, that the warrant was lawfully obtained, that he had relied on the information provided by the CI. Donovan was more circumspect, acknowledging mistakes but deflecting responsibility, claiming that decisions were made at multiple levels and that he couldn't be held accountable for every detail. Reed pressed both of them on the lack of verification. Detective Pierce, did you personally verify the address before executing the warrant? I relied on the information in the warrant application. So you didn't independently verify it? No. Did you conduct surveillance of the address? No. Did you check property records to confirm who lived there? No. Did you attempt to corroborate the CI's information through any other source? The CI had been reliable in the past. That's not what I asked, Reed said. Did you corroborate the information? No. The pattern was clear. No one had done their due diligence. They had taken the CI's word, applied for a warrant, and executed it without taking basic steps to ensure they were raiding the right house. It was negligence on a massive scale. As discovery continued, Reed's investigators uncovered more troubling information. The confidential informant, whose identity was still protected, had a history of providing tips that resulted in arrests, but he also had a history of exaggerating or fabricating details to increase his value to the department. In at least 2 previous cases, charges had been dropped or reduced when defense attorneys challenged the CI's credibility. Reed filed a motion to compel the disclosure of the CI's identity. The city fought back, arguing that revealing the CI would endanger his life and compromise future investigations. The judge scheduled a hearing to consider the motion. The hearing took place in a federal courtroom downtown. Reed presented his argument, citing cases where courts had ordered disclosure of CI identities when the information was critical to the defense. Your Honor, the CI's tip was the sole basis for the warrant. Without that tip, there's no raid, no shooting, no case. My clients have a right to know who provided the information and to challenge his credibility. The city's attorney, Philip Hargrove, countered. Your Honor, disclosing the CI's identity would put his life at risk. He's already received threats based on media coverage of this case. Revelation would have a chilling effect on future cooperation with law enforcement. The judge, a woman in her early 60s named Margaret Brennan, listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes. When both sides finished, she leaned back in her chair. I'm inclined to agree with the plaintiff that the CI's identity is relevant. However, I'm also mindful of the safety concerns. Here's what I'm going to do. I'll conduct an in-camera review. The city will provide me with the CI's identity and all related documents. I'll review them privately and determine whether disclosure is warranted. If I find that disclosure is necessary, I'll issue a protective order limiting how the information can be used. It was a compromise, but Reed would take it. The in-camera review meant the judge would see everything, and if the CI's credibility was as shaky as Reed suspected, the judge might order disclosure despite the city's objections. While the legal battle continued, life for Terrence and Simone slowly found a new rhythm. Simone began physical therapy for her shoulder, painful sessions where she worked to regain range of motion and strength. She also started seeing Dr. Monica Reeves, the trauma counselor Dr. Harper had recommended. The sessions were difficult, forcing Simone to confront the fear and anger she'd been trying to suppress. I keep thinking about that moment, Simone told Dr. Reeves during one session. The moment I was shot, and I keep asking myself, what did I do wrong? What could I have done differently? You didn't do anything wrong, Dr. Reeves said gently. What happened to you wasn't your fault. You were a victim of someone else's mistake and violence. But I moved, Simone said. That's what they keep saying. I moved, and that's why he shot me. You adjusted your position to breathe, Dr. Reeves corrected. That's not a crime. That's not a justification for being shot. The problem isn't what you did. The problem is that you were put in a situation where a natural, harmless movement was interpreted as a threat. And that's on them, not you. The words helped, but the healing was slow. Simone still flinched at unexpected sounds. She still had nightmares about the raid. She still struggled with the feeling that her home, the place that was supposed to be her sanctuary, had been violated in a way that could never be fully repaired. Terrence grappled with his own trauma, though he was less willing to acknowledge it. He threw himself into the lawsuit, reviewing documents, attending meetings with Reed, staying busy so he didn't have to sit with the feelings that threatened to overwhelm him when he slowed down. But at night, when the house was quiet and Simone was asleep beside him, he lay awake, replaying the raid in his mind, thinking about all the ways it could have been worse, all the ways he could have lost her. 6 months after the raid, Judge Brennan issued her ruling on the CI disclosure. She ordered the city to reveal the informant's identity to the plaintiff's attorneys under a protective order. The CI's name was Jerome Calloway, a 38-year-old man with a lengthy criminal record including drug possession, theft, and fraud. He had been working as a CI for the police department for 3 years, providing tips in exchange for leniency on his own charges. Reed's investigators dug into Calloway's background and found something explosive. 2 years earlier, Calloway had been involved in a dispute with a neighbor on Maple Ridge Drive. The neighbor had called the police on Calloway multiple times for noise complaints and suspicious activity. That neighbor lived at 4712 Maple Ridge Drive, the address listed on the warrant, the address the police had been trying to raid. It clicked into place. Calloway hadn't provided a tip about drug activity. He'd made it up to get revenge on a neighbor who had complained about him, and because no one had bothered to verify his information, his lie had resulted in the wrong house being raided and an innocent woman being shot. Reed filed an amended complaint adding Calloway as a defendant and including the new information about his motive. The media coverage exploded. Police raid based on revenge lie, Vanessa Hayes' headline read. The article detailed Calloway's background, the dispute with the neighbor, and the catastrophic consequences of the police department's failure to vet his information. The public outrage reached a fever pitch. Protests outside police headquarters, which had died down somewhat in recent months, flared up again. The interim police chief, Rebecca Hart, held a press conference acknowledging the failures and promising reforms. But her words rang hollow to many who had heard similar promises before. The city, facing mounting pressure and devastating evidence, finally approached Reed about a settlement. The initial offer was insulting $250,000 and no admission of wrongdoing. Reed rejected it immediately. We're not settling for pocket change and a non-apology. If the city wants to avoid trial, they need to come back with a serious offer. The negotiations dragged on for weeks. The city increased its offer to $500,000. Reed countered with $5 million plus policy reforms. The city balked. Reed prepared for trial, knowing that if the case went before a jury, the damages could be even higher. Then 3 weeks before the trial date, the city blinked. They offered $2.7 million, a formal apology, and a commitment to implement policy changes including a ban on no-knock warrants except in the most extreme circumstances, mandatory body cameras for all tactical operations, and independent oversight of raid planning and execution. Reed presented the offer to Terrence and Simone. They sat in his office, reading through the settlement agreement, weighing the decision. It's a good offer, Reed said. Not perfect, but good. The money will cover your medical expenses, lost wages, and provide financial security. And the policy changes are real. They're enforceable. If the city violates them, we can take them back to court. What about Walsh? Simone asked. What happens to him? He'll remain on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, Reed said. The settlement doesn't preclude criminal charges, though realistically, those are unlikely. But his career is effectively over. He'll never work in law enforcement again. Terrence looked at Simone. What do you think? Simone was quiet for a long moment. I want this to be over, she finally said. I want to move on. But I also want to make sure it means something, that it wasn't all for nothing. It means something, Reed assured her. The policy changes alone will prevent this from happening to other families. And the settlement amount sends a message that there are real consequences for this kind of misconduct. Okay, Simone said. Let's take it. Terrence nodded in agreement. Reed shook their hands. I'll finalize the paperwork. The settlement was announced a week later. The headlines were immediate and widespread. Blake family settles lawsuit for $2.7 million. City agrees to ban no-knock warrants after wrong address raid. The reaction was mixed. Some praised the settlement as a victory for accountability. Others criticized it as inadequate, arguing that money couldn't undo the trauma and that without criminal charges, true justice hadn't been served. But for Terrence and Simone, The settlement represented something more than money or policy changes. It represented validation, an acknowledgement that what had happened to them was wrong, that they had been failed by the system, and that their fight to hold that system accountable had mattered. The day the settlement check arrived, Terrence and Simone sat at their kitchen table staring at the envelope. It was anticlimactic, really. After 18 months of legal battles, depositions, negotiations, and sleepless nights, justice had been reduced to a piece of paper that could be deposited into a bank account. $2.7 million minus Reed's contingency fee and costs came out to just under $1.8 million. Life-changing money. But it didn't change what had happened. "How do you feel?" Terrence asked. Simone ran her finger along the edge of the envelope. "Empty," she admitted. "I thought I'd feel something. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction. But I just feel empty." Terrence understood. The settlement had closed one chapter, but it hadn't healed the wounds. Simone still went to therapy twice a week. She still had nightmares. She still couldn't walk into their bedroom without her chest tightening and her breath coming short. The physical wound in her shoulder had healed, leaving a raised scar that would never fully fade. But the psychological scars ran deeper, invisible but no less permanent. "Maybe we should move," Terrence suggested. "Start fresh somewhere else." Simone looked around the kitchen, at the home they'd built together. "I don't want them to take this from us too. They took our sense of safety, they took our peace of mind. I'm not letting them take our home." "Then we stay," Terrence said, "and we figure out how to make it ours again." They deposited the check and began the slow work of rebuilding. Simone reduced her teaching hours, unable to handle a full classroom schedule, while still managing her trauma recovery. The school was understanding, offering her a part-time position working with small groups of students who needed extra support. It was less money, but the settlement had eliminated financial pressure. She could focus on healing without worrying about bills. Terrence struggled more quietly. He hadn't returned to work at all since the raid. His job as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company felt meaningless now, disconnected from anything that mattered. He spent his days researching police reform initiatives, reading about other families who'd been through similar experiences, and trying to find purpose in the aftermath of trauma. One afternoon, he received a call from Isaiah Monroe, the neighbor who had organized the community meeting at the church months earlier. "Terrence, I've been thinking. A bunch of us in the neighborhood want to start a community oversight committee. Keep an eye on the police department, make sure they follow through on the reforms. We need someone with credibility to lead it, someone who's been through it. I think that's you." Terrence was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if I'm the right person." "You're exactly the right person," Isaiah said. "You understand the system. You fought it and won, and people trust you. Think about it." Terrence did think about it. For days. The idea of diving back into the world of police accountability, of reliving the trauma over and over by helping other families navigate similar situations, felt overwhelming. But it also felt necessary. If he didn't use what he'd learned, what he'd endured to help others, then what had it all been for? He talked to Simone about it. "I think I want to do this," he said. "But I need to know you're okay with it." Simone took his hand. "I'm okay with it, but promise me you'll take care of yourself too. You can't pour from an empty cup." "I promise," Terrence said. He accepted Isaiah's offer. The Community Oversight Committee held its first meeting 6 weeks after the settlement was finalized. 23 people showed up, a mix of neighbors, activists, and concerned citizens. They met in the basement of the same church where the first rally had been held, sitting in folding chairs arranged in a circle. Terrence stood at the front, nervous but determined. "Most of you know my story, but this isn't about me. It's about making sure what happened to my wife and me doesn't happen to anyone else. The city agreed to policy changes, but policies only matter if they're enforced. That's what we're here to do, hold them accountable, keep pressure on, and support families who are going through what we went through." The group organized quickly. They established a hotline for community members to report concerns about police conduct. They attended city council meetings, speaking during public comment periods, asking pointed questions about implementation of the reforms. They tracked data on police raids, use of force incidents, and complaint outcomes, and they built relationships with sympathetic officials inside the police department, officers who were just as frustrated by the culture of impunity as the community was. 6 months in, the committee scored its first major victory. A family in a neighboring district contacted them after a similar late-night raid this time. The police had entered with a regular warrant, but failed to announce themselves clearly. No one was shot, but the parents and 2 children had been forced onto the floor at gunpoint while the officers searched for a suspect who didn't live there. The committee's hotline recorded the call at 2:14 a.m. Within 24 hours, Terrence and 2 other members were standing on that family's doorstep, helping them file a formal complaint, contact attorneys, and connect with trauma counselors. The story spread quickly. Local news outlets now referred to the Blake Standard, shorthand for the reforms inspired by the Maple Ridge incident. Whenever police overstepped, citizens invoked the Blakes as proof that accountability was possible. Terrence didn't seek fame. He avoided interviews when he could, but his steady voice and military calm made him an anchor for the movement. Reporters described him as the reluctant activist, a man who never asked to lead but did because no one else could. Simone supported him quietly from home. Her recovery had plateaued physically. Her shoulder would never regain full range of motion, but her spirit had begun to heal. She started writing again, journaling her thoughts at Dr. Reeves's suggestion. One afternoon she read a passage to Terrence. "They took my safety," she wrote, "but not my purpose. If they meant to silence us, they only taught us how to speak louder." Terrence smiled. "That's exactly why we're still here." The committee's persistence forced the city council to hold quarterly public hearings on police conduct. At the first session, Chief Rebecca Hart presented a progress report. Since the reforms, no-knock warrants had dropped by 87%, all tactical teams were now equipped with functioning body cameras, and disciplinary actions for policy violations had increased by 42%. The numbers mattered, but what mattered more were the faces in the room. Families like the Blakes filled every seat listening, taking notes, and making sure the promises were kept. After the hearing, Hart approached Terrence in the hallway. "I know we started on opposite sides," she said, "but I want you to know these changes are real. They're holding." Terrence nodded. "Then keep them that way, because the day they slip, we'll be right back here." That night, Simone and Terrence sat on their porch under the soft glow of the rebuilt porch light. The air was cool, peaceful. For the first time in nearly 2 years, silence didn't feel threatening. It felt earned. But their fight was far from over. By the 2nd anniversary of the raid, the Blake story had become part of national discourse. Documentaries, podcasts, and university panels dissected it as a case study in reform. Jonathan Reed, their attorney, published a law review article titled "Wrong Door, Wrong Doctrine: The Limits of Qualified Immunity." It was cited in multiple federal appeals challenging the same shield that had nearly protected Officer Walsh. In Washington, a congresswoman from Oregon introduced the Maple Ridge Accountability Act, a bill proposing federal limits on no-knock warrants and mandating transparency in informant-based raids. When the bill reached committee hearings, Terrence and Simone were invited to testify. Simone hesitated. "I'm not a politician," she said. "You're a survivor," Terrence replied. "They need to see that." The morning of the hearing, the Capitol felt surreal. Marble halls, camera flashes, aides whispering into earpieces. Simone wore a dark blue dress that matched the sling still supporting her weaker arm. Terrence sat beside her at the witness table. When her turn came, she spoke softly but firmly into the microphone. "I was asleep in my own bed when armed men burst through my door. I did everything they told me to do, and I was still shot. The officer said he thought I moved. I did move because I was trying to breathe. If that's a reason to die in America, then something is terribly wrong." The room fell silent. Even the usually stoic committee members looked shaken. When the hearing ended, reporters surrounded the couple, shouting questions. Simone answered, "Only one. Do you think justice was served?" "Justice isn't a check," she said. "It's change." and we're still waiting to see if it lasts. The bill advanced out of committee with bipartisan support. It would take another year before it passed the House, but the momentum was undeniable. Across the country, states began enacting their own versions of the Blake reform restrictions on no-knock raids, mandatory verification of informant tips, independent oversight panels modeled on Terrence's committee. Back home, the Blakes returned to something close to normal. Simone taught part-time again, focusing on art projects with children who'd experienced trauma. She painted with them, letting color replace words when words were too hard. Terrence began teaching community safety workshops for veterans and civilians alike, how to assert rights calmly, how to record encounters legally, how to survive interactions that too often turned deadly. At night, they'd still talk about that moment, the door exploding, the sound, the flash, but it had shifted from terror to testimony. The story was no longer just theirs. It belonged to everyone who refused to be silent. 3 years after the raid, the city of Seattle unveiled a memorial garden downtown, small, quiet, set beside the municipal courthouse. A bronze plaque at the entrance read, "In memory of those harmed by wrongful police actions, may justice be louder than fear." The dedication ceremony drew hundreds. Community members, activists, officers, and city leaders stood together, an uneasy but genuine attempt at unity. Simone and Terrence were asked to speak. Terrence looked out over the crowd, recognizing faces from every stage of their ordeal. Dr. Harper, Vanessa Hayes, Nia Patterson, Isaiah Monroe, and even Chief Hart. "This garden," he said, "isn't about grief. It's about responsibility. Every blade of grass here was planted by someone who decided the story couldn't end in silence." Then Simone stepped forward. "People ask if I've forgiven the officer who shot me," she began. "The truth is, forgiveness isn't the point. Accountability is. Forgiveness without change is just permission to do it again." The audience applauded quietly, no cheers, no chants, just the steady rhythm of hands acknowledging truth. After the ceremony, Vanessa Hayes approached them. Her articles had long since won national awards, but she still spoke to them as friends. "I'm writing a book," she said, "not about tragedy, about endurance. I'd like to include your story, but only if you approve." Simone smiled faintly. "Just promise you'll tell it the way it happened." "I will," Vanessa said. "Every word." That evening, the Blakes returned home to find a letter in the mail. It was from Dr. Evelyn Harper, the surgeon who had saved Simone's life. Inside was a short note. "Every time I hear a patient thank a nurse for saving them, I think of you both. You reminded me that healing isn't just surgery, it's justice. Thank you for fighting for all of us." Simone placed the letter in a small wooden box beside her bed. It joined the court documents, the settlement papers, and the photo from the day of the committee's first meeting, a timeline of pain turned into purpose. Later that night, Terrence stood at the window watching rain streak down the glass. "You?" "No," he said softly. "If someone told me 3 years ago that this would be our life, I'd have said they were crazy." Simone walked up beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. "We survived," she whispered. "That's enough." But survival, they both knew, was just the beginning. 5 years after the raid, Maple Ridge Drive looked ordinary again. Fresh paint, trimmed lawns, the hum of sprinklers on summer mornings. But for the Blakes, the address would always mean something else. Every year on April 12th, the date of the raid, they hosted a neighborhood barbecue. It wasn't a memorial. It was a celebration of community resilience. Dozens showed up. Neighbors, reporters, former protesters, even a few police officers who'd joined under Chief Hart's new reform unit. The event was called The Night We All Woke Up. Simone had become a sought-after speaker at trauma recovery conferences. Her talk, From Victim to Voice, opened with the same line each time. "Healing isn't forgetting. It's remembering without breaking." Terrence chaired the city's newly formed Civilian Accountability Board, an official watchdog group that had grown directly out of his community committee. They had subpoena power now, real authority to investigate misconduct. He carried a badge, of his own silver, engraved with CAB not to enforce the law but to make sure it was enforced fairly. The Maple Ridge Accountability Act finally passed in Congress that year. When the president signed it into law, Simone and Terrence were invited to the White House ceremony. Cameras flashed as they stood behind the desk where the bill was signed. The president handed Simone one of the ceremonial pens and said, "This happened because you refused to stay quiet." On the flight home, Simone held the pen like a relic. "It doesn't fix what happened," she said, "but maybe it prevents the next one." Terrence nodded. That's all we ever wanted. When they landed back in Seattle, the city council had lit the municipal building in gold and blue, the colors of the Blake Foundation, a nonprofit the couple had started to fund trauma therapy for victims of police violence. Donations poured in after the law passed, allowing them to open counseling centers in 4 states. One night, long after the lights in the house had dimmed, Terrence found Simone sitting on the porch again, just like that first quiet evening after the hearing years ago. Fireflies drifted through the humid air. She looked peaceful, reflective. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How far we've come," she said, "and how far there still is to go." Terrence sat beside her, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulders. The scar beneath her sleeve caught the porch light, faint now, but permanent, proof that pain could harden into purpose. "Do you ever think about leaving this behind?" he asked. She smiled sadly. "We already did. What's left is the work." Down the street, kids rode bicycles under the street lamps, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. Across the road, Nia Patterson watered her garden, waving when she saw them. Life had resumed its rhythm, not perfect, but real. Simone leaned her head against Terrence's shoulder. "You know what's strange?" she said. "For the first time in years, I'm not afraid when I hear a door open." Terrence squeezed her hand. "That's because it's ours again." The porch light flickered once in the breeze, then steadied. Bright, unwavering, and warm. And for the first time since 1:17 a.m. on that long-ago night, peace finally meant something they could believe in.